everyone. I hope you had a breathing. So we will continue from our last panel on politics of belonging, voices of silencing to the roundtable, the people in and against liberal democratic thought, and move into a little bit more political philosophy. Thank you for your patience and collaboration so far. And thank you for our panelists, all distinguished professors, and for Professor Tucker chairing the panel. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Aviezer Tucker. I work at the University of Ostrava in the Czech Republic, and I'm chairing the session. We have a true smorgasbord of papers on very different topics. We may end up with an eintopf, but we'll see. We have 20 minutes for each paper, and then there'll be half an hour for questions. We'll start according to the order with Naomi Waltham-Smith. We will listen to her. Then there will be a change of order. Bruno Godfrey will speak next, and then there will be a book presentation by Karen Horn and Julian Miller. So without further ado, let's listen to Naomi's music.
Thank you very much. So I should say that I am a slightly hard to place interdisciplinary scholar. I'm technically in the music faculty, but I'm a philosopher of listening and sound and sometimes music, though increasingly less often. I'm also going to, I don't have a formal paper. I'm going to talk from some notes about a project that I'm currently working on that intersects very nicely, I think, with the theme of the conference. And so I'm very grateful. I want to say thank you so much for the invitation to speak. So in October 2024, late October, the former Arkansas governor, Mike Huckabee, said, "Next Tuesday, when he wins and becomes not only the 45th, but the 47th president of the United States, this is going to be a time that we can celebrate again having a president that listens to the people rather than demands that the people listen to them." And there he was speaking, of course, of Donald Trump, who went on the next Tuesday, indeed, to win. More recently, just a few days ago, Zoran Mamdani, on winning the Democratic primary in New York in the mayoral race, said, "Too often in politics, there's a desire to impose what you think the debate is upon the people that you're seeking to represent, as opposed to listening. One of the hopes we had in our campaign was to move our political instinct from lecturing to listening." And I could give you, I think probably in that interview alone, he used the term listening about 20 times or a cognate. So the rhetoric, though, of these two relatively recent US campaigns is not new or unique, and it's certainly not unique to the context of the US. I could reel off many more examples going back a number of years in the European context again. But since we are here in the UK, I'm going to give you two choice examples among the archive that I have that go back some time ago. The first of these goes back 50 years to February 1975, when Margaret Thatcher wrote a letter to her local party chairman in Finchley, declaring her intention to stand as a candidate for leader of the Conservative Party. And in that letter, she uses the term listen or listening 8 times, and it is the rhetorical focus of the letter, where she takes a series of short paragraphs, each of which begins with a promise or a declaration of intent to listen to different demographics within the country. And she says, I won't read you the entire letter, but she says early in the letter, "Our greatest fault in office was that we did not listen enough. If we had only listened more carefully to what our supporters and potential supporters were saying, we might not be in opposition today." And those of you may have seen the recent sort of fictionalized portrayal. If you're in this country, I think back early in the year, Steve Kogan did a fictional portrayal of Margaret Thatcher's last television interview. And in that interview, very, very famously, a journalist who'd been very sympathetic to her decides to challenge her much, much more brutally. And on that point in particular, her failure is one of failing to listen, but not to the people, to listen to members of her own party. And that was the kind of diagnosis, if you like, or judgment the next day in the papers after that interview was broadcast, that she had lost her ability to listen and had failed to do that both to her own party and therefore, at the time, it was seen to the country. Slightly more recently, Tony Blair, when he won his historic third term in May 2005, rather famously declared, it was the headline in all but one of the national newspapers, "I've listened and I've learned. We, the government, are going to focus now relentlessly on the priorities the people have set for us." And that probably that I've listened and learned was interpreted primarily as being in reference to the Iraq War. But of course, he would go on to hemorrhage increasing votes in by-elections and local elections during his third term, especially in areas that we now call the Red Wall. And your final example, and I'll try and move on to theorizing a little bit. Lord Ashdown, who's a pollster as well as former politician, wrote a sort of well-known report called Time to Smell the Coffee about the Tory party's defeat in, I can't remember which year that was, but he writes then Labour's turn to smell the coffee in February 2020 after the loss in December 2019. And in that document, the word listen features 18 times. It's not a long document. It's the word that appears, it's the, apart from conjunctions and so on, it's the word that appears most frequently, both from his focus group and polling, but also in his own assessment. And he sums this up by saying, the Labour Party failed to understand or even listen to the people it was supposed to represent. And he cites a representative example from a focus group, someone saying they are no longer listening to the people. And there are plenty of other invocations in that kind of language in Ashdown's research. So I set that as a backdrop to talk about the link between two concepts, listening and the people. The concept that we are preoccupied with this week. And I'm going to talk about them as both impossible concepts. I want to say a little bit why I'm framing it in that way. And I'll say more about listening than on the people, because the people is the focus for this conference, and there are plenty of other far more interesting and erudite people who have more exciting things to say about that. But I will say something about why I think the people is also an impossible concept. So it's undoubtedly a contested concept in Carl Schmitt's sense, or in the sense used by intellectual historians. Schmitt says famously that political concepts are political in a double sense. They are both about politics, but they are also caught up and ensnared in it themselves. They are subject to political contestation. And the people is arguably a paradigm of Carl Schmitt's political concept. He says that what makes a concept political, what ensnares it in politics, is that it can be wielded in a given moment, in a given context, to create an opposition between me and an adversary, between one group and an enemy. And it's very, very clear, I think, and I'm sure this was touched on many times, even after I had to leave yesterday, that the people is mobilized in that fashion to create us and another group in opposition, or multiple other groups sometimes. So listening, by contrast, is a much less familiar concept, and perhaps doesn't even reach the level of a concept. If I was having coffee with you and asked you, tell me 5 or 10 political concepts, you're very unlikely. I've tried this to strangers on trains and people in coffee shops. None of them ever say listening, and I'm very, very disappointed that they don't reassure me in my research project. But it also reassures me that I'm doing something interesting, hopefully, and new, because as far as I know, there is no dictionary of political concepts, no lexicon in which listening is an entry. So we'd find things like democracy, equality, liberalism, and so on and so forth. And yet listening is something that trips off the tongue very easily in today's political vernacular, not only in English, but I have a whole archive of examples in other countries in multiple languages as well. But it doesn't appear to be a contested political concept. It doesn't seem to be something people fight over. This means listening, that means listening. No, that's not what it means. It has a strange ubiquity and yet is not involved. It's not been politicized. It's not been mobilized in that way, but it is mobilized very frequently as a complaint about political elites, or as a kind of promise to do something better, to be perhaps more responsive in government, and more attentive in some way that is yet to be specified. But I would argue that it's in some ways the opposite of a contested concept. The fact that it's so polysemous, that it can have so many different meanings. This metaphor is very convenient. It's used to paper over political differences. I could go on the doorstep during an election campaign, and in order to attain the sympathy and confidence of the person, I could say, yeah, they're just not listening, are they? And I'd get a lot of nods, even if they would have historically voted consistently for a party, a completely different part of the spectrum from me, or if their analysis of the current situation were completely different. And yet I'd probably get widespread support for that idea that governments or people in power are not listening as well as they used to, or perhaps also that other citizens are not listening to them. So there's a kind of resonance to this term, and perhaps it's just a metaphor. It has a rhetorical utility, and there's not much more to it. It's perhaps just belongs in the vox pop and isn't part of political philosophy. Maybe it's just a sort of sentiment and isn't worthy of being a political concept. But I'm going to suggest that we might try and construct it as one, but that it has a certain impossibility about it. So why am I also saying that the people is an impossible concept? You might think, well, I've said it's contested, but not necessarily impossible. And I think if we think back to what Professor Canon Reverend Brotherton was saying yesterday in our opening panel, he talked about the difficulty of the project of universalization, that it inevitably ends up being exclusionary of someone when we speak of the people. And I want to come back to that idea at the end of my remarks. But it's in that sense that the people seems to be an impossible concept, because it stumbles on the problem, a sort of generic philosophical problem, if you like, of totality. How do we construct totalities? What is the link between the particular and universal? So a very generic philosophical problem that isn't necessarily even a political problem. Listening, by contrast, seems to be impossible in a different way, impossible even to conceive of as a concept. It's too baggy, too vague. It doesn't have the consistency or the boundaries of a concept. So Frege says, for example, that concept is defined as much by what it excludes as what it contains. There's nothing really to contest here. There's no substance to get into it. So my current project is a kind of search, if you like, for a concept of listening in the history of political thought. And rarely does it rise to the level of a concept or even a term in philosophical discourse. And I like to think of myself as sort of going on a treasure hunt, where I look in the dark margins of other concepts and other ideas, or perhaps I turn over the stone of another concept, and on the underside is this notion of listening. Or sometimes it's there as an unaccented word, but one on which everything seems to turn in a particular argument when one starts to get into the detail. Or sometimes listening emerges as the only concept that might bring together another constellation of concepts that might help us to think of the relation between them or the changing relations between them. So obviously I can't cover the extent of the entirety of the project, and I'm only midway through it, but I'm going to say something about how this relates to our current conjuncture, and also then a bit about one example. So why do I think the current conjuncture has anything to do with listening or a crisis of listening? They're just not listening. People keep moaning and politicians keep promising that they are listening, or that they uniquely will listen to the people. Why would I take seriously this seemingly vernacular, popular diagnosis if it doesn't seem to have the critical rigor of theory or perhaps political scientific research? So my conceit is that I take it seriously as a diagnosis of the present. And I'm going to try and say how three sort of main or hegemonic accounts of our present conjuncture are implicitly endorsing this view of a problem with listening. So let's take perhaps the most common one, which is the idea that the resurgence of far-right politics today is a backlash against the silent revolution in cultural values, as a result of an increasing salience of what is often thought of as a second cleavage, a cultural cleavage, besides a socioeconomic one, and that this has been mediated by the role of political parties in bringing about class de-alignment, accelerated by economic factors like austerity. And the idea is broadly that people gained in the post-war period in prosperity and economic security. Therefore, their values became known as post-materialist values in Inglehart's term, more concerned about the environment, gender equality, and so on, because they had to be less worried about putting food on a plate. The idea is this is also accelerated by deindustrialization and a move to an economy's job sector. Also, the democratization of higher education, urban agglomeration, and the sort of sorting of populations between cities and less well-populated peri-urban or rural areas, aging populations in many European democracies. And the crude real version of this is the one that Aurelian spoke about yesterday, the left behind white working class. More subtle versions of the analysis will distinguish between the economically, demographically, and precariously left behind, explaining the different electoral voting preferences of those different groups. But on this account, on this sort of backlash, values-based account, listening means something like empathy or understanding, perhaps respect. I want respect for my views that are out of step with a liberal majority. Perhaps care. Sometimes it's an expression for that. Sometimes it's an expression of feeling a loss of relative privilege. And that's something that comes out in the account. So kind of recognition of value and contribution in society. On a slightly different account, more political economic, there's an analysis of people like Mark Blyth, Jonathan Hopkin, for example, building on the work of Katz and Mayer, that looks at party systems and macroeconomic regimes, suggesting that once we get universal suffrage, political parties face a collective action problem, how to coordinate all their interests in parliament. And the party is designed to create this, partly by creating a sense of corporate identity among their voters, but also by creating a sort of policy program that seems to be responsive to the needs and interests of a section of society. But in the post-war period, as that macroeconomic regime in many European countries and in the US leads to sustained economic growth, we see an expansion of public goods. So parties in government are able to offer benefits not only to their core electorate, but to a wider spread of the population. This looks good for a while the macroeconomic regime holds up. But as that starts to crumble in the 70s and fails, parties have kind of, as it were, overstretched themselves with promises, searching for the median voter, or wider and wider set of voters. Catch-all parties run into this problem when the economy isn't working so well for that kind of approach. And then we sort of see like a revenge of capital in the 70s against relatively, profitable position for labor during the post-war period, and full employment and all these kinds of challenges for capital. And so we see really parties trying to double down on more of this approach, approaching the average middle voter, untethering themselves from their core electorate. And so on this kind of account, what happens is parties stop listening to the people they're supposed to represent. And we see that coming across in feedback in Ashdown's analysis, for example. And often this analysis is described as a kind of backlash against neoliberalism, the idea that in neoliberalism there's a convergence of center-left and center-right parties on a kind of neoliberal consensus. And the problem there is they really tie their own hands, technocracy, they sort of outsource decision-making on economic issues to technocrats, to central banks. And the problem is that they're then unable to kind of be, even if they wanted to be responsive to their core electorates, who then feel disillusioned. A kind of final analysis might say that it's not really a case that parties made themselves generically unresponsive as a result of their kind of success during the post-war period in delivering more public goods more widely. In fact, neoliberalism or market liberalism even before that has always had to inoculate itself against popular demands. And we see this illustrated in Quinn Slobodian's recent book, Hayek's Bastards, for example, the idea that certain sectors of capital were actually increasingly afraid that democracy, of too much democracy, countering their interests. And so a number of scholars have looked at how so free market liberalism, economic freedoms have gone alongside with increasingly kind of repressive apparatus, often with scapegoating of the other or finding someone else to blame, but also an increasingly narrow opportunity for resistance or collective action, especially with the disciplining of labor. So listening in this account doesn't really look like people are complaining about a lack of responsiveness. It looks more like a very deliberate, strategic use of selective listening and selective silencing of particular groups in order to manufacture consent and repress dissent in some way.
Reach a finale.
Sorry?
We need to reach a finale.
Yes, there's 3 more minutes.
Yeah.
We started at 5 past.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? So I've been looking in the history of political philosophy for some thoughts about this. And I'll give you just sort of one example. Listening crops up all the time when we're thinking about the question of representation, of how one listens to the people. And we might find this in particular in the thought of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, who I'm looking at together, looking at this question of at what point must the sovereign listen to the people? And Hobbes's view is once they've handed over authorization, essentially, they don't need to ever again. Locke is more open to pluralism and also thinks that the people can hold the sovereign to account. But Rousseau's analysis is particularly interesting because he's quite skeptical about the idea that deliberation, that sort of tactic we often reach for today in order to listen to the people, would actually be satisfactory, because he says that private interests will prevail. And with existing inequality, it will be impossible for deliberation to bring the will of all wills together into a general will. So Rousseau's problem then is the one that Luke Bretherton talked about, the problem of how do you universalize a set of collective wills that may be in disagreement with one another, and some voices may be more or less audible than others due to existing inequalities. And Rousseau talks about that chiefly in terms of property ownership and other wealth. So Rousseau says that must be justice is what will here enable us to proceed from the will of lots of wills collectively in aggregate to a totality of wills. And I think I want to suggest then, or explore the idea that listening might be another word or a different kind of word for that sort of justice that will equal the distribution of audibility. And it's in that we might pursue a project of a kind of universal or a kind of totality. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you. Punktlich.
I think I have a presentation, so maybe I should move there. Or...
Right. Actually, how do I pronounce your name? Godfrey?
Well, Godfrey is fine.
Godfrey.
That's like the English way to pronounce it. That's fine.
And what's the correct way? Godfrey.
There is no correct way. But in French, that would be Godfrey. No worries. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present this kind of thought experiment on this roundtable on the living generation as a presenter's conception of the people. So wait, that's fine. Okay, so this kind of thought experiment starts from if you want an observation, namely that populism does not come out of nowhere, but rather emerges in a specific context, in the context of a crisis, the crisis of representative democracy, which can be observed in different phenomena, such as a lack of trust in established institutions, a lack of trust in established political parties, a declining membership, a lack of support for these parties, and a lack of adaptation to new challenges, such as, for example, climate change, and difficulties to design new modes of participation. So this crisis reactivates what has been called the paradox of constitutionalism, which means that modern constitutionalism, in a way, is characterized by the attempt to give the constituent power to the people, while at the same time creating institutions protected from constitutional change. So in a way, the constituent sovereign, in this sense, only acts once before falling asleep, or as some have said, the sovereign has fallen into a coma or is imprisoned by the same act of constitution making that brought it into being. So in this context, I think that populist answers try to, I mean, we've talked about this yesterday, so I will be a little bit quicker on that, emphasize the constituent power of the people to impose formal constitutional amendments presented as a kind of necessary answer to this crisis of representative democracy, but these constitutional changes have a tendency on the long term to endanger democracy itself and to cause its erosion. So there are many examples for that. For example, the constitutional reform in Venezuela in 2007, which aimed at removing term limits, which is also quite common in this kind of populist attempts, or the Hungarian Constitution of 2012, another example of constitutional change aiming at eroding democracy on the long term. And this constitutional aspect is, I think, so important that it has been used as one of the core elements to define populism in many definitions. So that's one example. Arauto and Cohen define populism as a strategy of political mobilization for attaining or retaining, or the very least strongly influencing government and power by an appeal to popular sovereignty and by an appeal to the constituent power of the people. Another example is this definition. So populism tried to attribute the full constituent power to the electorate as an embodiment of the people. So as you can see, this idea of the people as a constituent sovereign, as wielding full constituent power, is a core element in the definition of populism. But you can already see in these different definitions that there are also different alternatives to, or different answers to populism understood in this way. First possibility, so there are two positions basically. A first one against reactivation of the constituent power of the people. One conception will try to neutralize it by arguing that the currently existing people are not the people as such, and that therefore they cannot wield the full constituent power. So the consequence of this position is to advocate for what has been called constitutional resistance or constitutional entrenchment, so trying to protect established institutions and to prevent constitutional changes. Another position, which has been called, what we can call it political or democratic constitutionalism, argues on the contrary that contemporary populism has, in a way, a point that should be taken seriously, and that the answer is not constitutional resistance, constitutional entrenchment, but rather trying to further democratize established institutions by using constitutional change, but also making sure that this further democratization is possible in the future. So unlike populist answers which are trying to make it actually impossible in the future by attacking democracy. So more or less explicitly, both positions have a very different understanding of the people, and that's what I will try to explain here. The first one has more understanding of the people as a transgenerational people, a transgenerational entity, whereas the second one, has a different conception of the people. Which conception? It's not entirely clear. I think it requires some work on the concept of the people And basically my point here is to try to develop this kind of conception of the people as, present this conception of the people as the living generation. The first position argues that the people has a permanent collective identity. Since this position tries to limit the constituent power of the people, it will argue that the people has this kind of transgenerational collective identity. The aim is to answer a problem, namely what has been called intergenerational sovereignty. So how can you basically defend the claim that laws enacted by a generation of citizens of a country still has some authority on the present generations of the citizens of this country? The solution to this problem is to claim that is this conception of the people as a transgenerational political entity. So it's actually quite similar. I mean, I'm quite critical of this conception because I think there are several problems associated with understanding the people in this way. First, it's actually quite similar to already to what Edmund Burke claimed, so that basically the state, as he said, is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. This was in the reflections on the revolution in France, and the aim was to kind of delegitimize revolutionary changes. Nowadays, there are different ways to defend this conception, but there are actually two sides of the problem. So the first side of the problem is what I call the identity problem. So how do you ground the people's collective identity? How do you defend this idea that the people has a collective identity? Not that easy. First possibility, you can find it, for example, in Schmitt's constitutional theory, is a kind of existential argument. So the people have a kind of pre-legal existence that grounds its collective identity. The people has a consciousness of political particularity. The people has a will, or have a will to political existence, etc. So in a way, the main criteria is a kind of pre-legal homogeneity, which can be a kind of ethnic homogeneity. So this is Schmitt, but it's also, you can also find this kind of argument in contemporary liberal political theory, such as in this book, Alessandro Ferrara's Sovereignty Across Generations, where he tries to distinguish between an ethnos and a demos. So ethnos is a kind of also pre-political unity, which grounds the demos as a kind of as the kind of political people. And it's actually quite similar because this ethnos also shares a kind of language, a culture, but also maybe a kind of common ethnicity. One problematic example is a decision of the German Constitutional Court, quite famous, 1993, on the Maastricht Treaty. And this decision, the court argued that what is needed for people is a kind of intellectual, social, or political homogeneity. And since there is no such thing as this unity, homogeneity on the European level, there should be limits to European integration. And democracy, according to this decision, is only possible in the national state, but not on a broader level. Has been criticized, I mean, of course, very much. But you can see here a kind of concrete example of concrete consequence of trying to understand the people in this way. Second problem is what I call the time problem. So whether this collective identity is permanent and unchanging. So if you argue that the people have a collective identity, next problem is this collective identity permanent and unchanging? So on that issue, the answers are quite different from populist answers, so to say, since this position will try to argue that the permanent transgenerational collective identity of the people also prevents the exercise of constituent power by the living generation. So that's also very important to in this attempt to neutralize the constituent power of the people. So how do they answer this this problem, the time problem? First, with what I call here the two bodies argument. So it's in a way they will argue that the people has a kind of second body, which is unchanging, permanent, not temporal. There are different ways to do that. You can claim that by adopting a constitution, a kind of intemporal juridical entity has been created, which is called the people and will not change. Or you can argue with Ferreira, for example, that the demos is also unchanging. Or you can also use the concept of nation, for example. So in the French context, it's of course a very important concept, and it has been used to neutralize the idea of popular sovereignty. So just to give a few examples, two jurists, Esmin and Carré de Malberg, very famous French jurists, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, argued that since the sovereignty belongs to the nation and not to the concrete people there is, for example, no need of universal suffrage, or there is also no need to include women in the people, because what matters is basically this abstract concept of the nation and not the concrete individuals. All these different ways to defend a kind of unchanging permanent collective identity have similar consequences, namely defending what has been called a sequential conception of sovereignty. So, which means that the sovereignty does not belong to every generation, but only belongs to the people as this kind of abstract transgenerational entity. And also a kind of common reaction to populism, according to this view. The proper way to protect or to react against populism would be to neutralize the exercise of popular sovereignty and constituent power, and to protect existing institutions against constitutional change. So that's one possibility. The other one would be, this alternative, the idea of a presentist conception of the people. That's why what I'm trying to develop here. It's part of a bigger project, but just want to give you the main ideas there. The idea would be to take seriously populism's demand for more democracy, also to enable constitutional innovation, not as an elitist project, but as based on popular sovereignty, and to take seriously what has been called sometimes the temporal dimension of democracy. So when you read contemporary works on democracy, sometimes there is this idea that democracy is presentist, is too much focused on the present and cannot take into account, long-term problems. My idea is kind of to bite the bullet and say, yes, it's presentist and it's not a problem. And it can be used actually to answer these problems. So, of course, this is not a very new idea. You probably know this, or heard these quotes, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and Condorcet are three of probably of the most famous authors who tried to develop this kind of presentist conception. Jefferson claimed that the earth belongs to the living, one generation is to another, another as one independent nation to another, or the dead have no rights, they are nothing. So this kind of very famous quotes, just to give you an idea. But again, how do you answer both problems, the identity problem and time problem, from this perspective? The identity problem, so we saw that there is the first possibility was to understand the people as a kind of unchanging collective identity, but it's also possible to understand the people as the community of the living at a given instant. I think that this conception has been somehow neglected and could be revived in the context of this presentist conception of the people. So does it mean that the people have no collective identity at all? which would be also problematic if you want to understand then political action. I don't think so, but it's probably possible in this framework to understand this collective identity not as a kind of unchanging collective, permanent collective identity, but as a thin, temporally limited collective identity. So not as something substantial and unchanging, but as something which is temporally limited. Why? It has something to do with the answer to the time problem. So if you think of the people in terms of the living generation, why do we try to think the people as the living generation? The idea is of the generation, why using this concept of generation, which is also, of course, an abstraction. The idea is to claim that an understanding of a kind of limited continuity and limited collective identity is possible. So what matters in this view is the idea that what people have in common is, or what the people have in common is first and foremost a kind of coexistence, and that the sovereignty of the living generation means that this kind of coexistence is the criteria of the unity, if you want, of the people. So if you understand the people in this way, it also means that what is important is not that every single people at every moment explicitly consented to the constitution, which would be actually impossible. But the idea is that in the plurality of the people, at every instant, there should be a majority that gave its explicit consent to the constitution. That was Jefferson's idea, and that's why he claimed that constitutions have a limited validity of approximately 20 years at that time. So the idea, as you can see here, the existence of the people understood as the living generation is not completely ephemeral, but temporally limited to a certain period. So this conception has been criticized, of course, for its lack of stability, the negative impact on political legitimacy, and many other, criticisms. I won't develop that here. Just a few words to conclude on the consequences on institutions and constitutions of such a conception. So the idea, it's not entirely, it's not just theory and not just political theory. The idea is to think about the practical consequences of such a conception. And I think it should invite us to look beyond constitutional entrenchment as the only answer to populism. There are namely other mechanisms that could be used as an answer to populism. For example, the periodic constitutional convention. So that was Jefferson's, Condorcet's, and Paine's idea at the time. So that you need to have constitutional conventions every, let's say, 20 years, for example, to renew the popular consent to the Constitution. So that would be a possibility to kind of have a concrete answer to this conception of the people. Another possibility is the mandatory constitution referendums. So it's in some American states, you still have this mechanism in place, which means that every 10 or 20 years, depends on which state, the people have to vote whether they want to have a constitutional convention to change or improve the constitution. And by doing so, they also kind of renew their consent to the established institutions. And so many different states, from Alaska to Connecticut, and yeah, just 2 minutes, I'm almost done. And last possibility, temporary or sunset constitutions or temporary constitutional provisions. So it has been used also in the past in different countries. So it's basically the idea that that a constitution doesn't have to be permanent, and that constitutional provisions do not have to be permanent, but that they can have a kind of sunset condition, a time limit, which enables improving them in the future or changing them. Even like the German basic law is actually, to some extent, you could say, a temporary constitution. So that's another possibility, another possible concretization in constitutional law of this presentist conception of the people. There are other examples, of course, but we can talk about that later. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
All right, so I'm pleased to introduce Karen Julian. They have a new anthology that they will talk about, which I'm sure it's with De Gruyter. Oh, well, you'll have to get probably a second mortgage to buy it. But other than that, I encourage you to review it. Please.
Sure stuff.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for allowing us to present our book. It contains a lot of ideas that will resonate with a few of us. And for example, when Bruno was just talking, I realized that we have one paper in the book by Max Friebe, who's pretty much on that point regarding representation, the expectance that, or what people hope that will come out of the political process. They're being listened to too. So you might be interested in that. Yeah, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit of background, and then I will give you a few ideas of what you will be able to find in the book, and maybe some of you will be interested in having a look. I have it here, so whoever wants to browse it later on, feel free to come toward me and ask me about it. So this is a book that came out at the beginning of this year, so it's still relatively fresh. And it was a project by the News Network. You see it in the bottom of the cover of the book, and I also have it here. What is news? That's probably the first question that I should be answering here, and I will try to move on. Yeah, so news is an academic network. It now contains round about 200 people. We have 200 people altogether, but 100, it's half and half, 100 senior scholars, 100 young affiliates. Part of them are still doing their PhD thesis, others are postdocs, etc. And we have quite a lot of activity for the younger ones to promote them in their careers. The network was founded in 2015 in Germany by a German group of scholars, but that doesn't mean it is limited to Germany or that it is just taking place in German language. We are international and we are trying to speak proper English if we can. It's an interdisciplinary network, which means that we have people from all kinds of backgrounds: philosophy, sociology, political philosophy, political science. And I'm an economist, and there are also other economists there in the group. And we try to learn from each other and to have projects in common that we work on together to be able to learn from each other and create something new. I forgot the historians, we also have historians. And I'm an economist and a historian of economic thought. So you have this history element in there in my own work as well. You're international. We have people who live in Argentina, in the US, but also in Singapore, Japan, and Europe, of course. So we're a little bit all over the place. And we discovered during COVID that it was a wonderful thing to have this network and to use Zoom. So we have monthly formats where we all, not all, but groups come together and discuss certain issues. And that's very fruitful, I think. We are non-activist. We are not aiming to promote anything. We're really just purely academic in the sense that we try to make sense of the topics that we are interested in. In that sense, we are also non-partisan and specifically non-sectarian. That is something that you find within a lot of structures where, for example, liberal agendas are being discussed. That is not our aim. Many of us have liberal persuasions, but that's something that is not interesting in our work. We are interested in all things liberal, but liberalism is a very broad field for us. What do we do? I said so, academic conferences. We have academic workshops, which we do in cooperation with universities, mainly with universities of Erfurt, which is my university, and the University of Freiburg, to which my co-chair has affiliations. We do these monthly academic online discussions, which is a nice format, both for younger scholars who present their PhD work as it is ongoing and developing, but also for senior scholars who are onto new projects. It's like a doctoral workshop in a sense. We have these wide beam formats where people present their books and discuss books with others. That's a longer format, 2 hours, very intense, very, I think, absolutely lovely and fruitful. We do academic publications like this one, but also others. We have academic seminars at universities, and we also, that's a service to the history of thought, we translate classical texts that do not exist in English, which is especially important for economics because many texts stem either from Germany or from Austria and are not available for English readers. You will say that with DeepL and other AI instruments, that's not a problem anymore, but I do think so that precision of translation is important to really work on something. Now, this book was the project that we called Liberal Responses to Populism, and it was an academic workshops with contributions that we picked after just a normal public call for papers. And we asked 3 questions. One was, does classical liberalism need to rethink its relationship to democracy? Well, you know this discussion about, well, them having a certain tension with ideas of democracy. Some people perhaps preferring the rule of law to democratic deliberation and majority rule in decision making. So is that something that needs to be rethought, corrected, reframed, whatever? Question B was, can we develop classical liberalism at the conceptual or the institutional level in the face of populism? Is there something that should be done, must be done, can be done? And specifically, Julian was interested in the question whether there are potential benefits and threats of the digital transformation to democratic governance in the future and to liberal democracy. Sorry, moving on. So if we're dealing with the question of populism and liberalism, it is for a reason, or for many reasons. One of them is that we sense that populism is dangerous for liberty and liberal democracy, and thus also for the role of political liberalism as an agent in society. I'm not talking about philosophy, the liberal philosophy, I'm talking about liberal parties, about people who deem themselves liberal. If populism gains more ground, it will be will have some relevance for what it means to be a liberal. It's also something that we deem important because, as Jan Werner Müller, only a namesake, said when he wrote in 2016 that democracy requires pluralism and the need to find fair terms of living together as free, equal, but also irreducibly diverse citizens. Liberals believe in freedom and equality and in diversity, and it might be that populism doesn't promote these ends, to say the least. So the question for us is, what can liberals do? You know, not only those who oppose the trend of criticizing liberalism as perhaps a promoter of populism. We wanted to know, what can liberals do against populism? There's a lot of soul searching involved, putting the liberal house itself in order, trying to correct where we erred, trying to correct where liberals had a blind eye or a blind angle, and then also looking ahead and trying to seek approaches that remain liberal. And you probably know the work of Josh Chernis, who presented a number of thinkers who tried to navigate that conundrum. If you see that there are developments in society that are liberty side, you can try to counter that by forbidding certain parties, as it is being discussed in Germany right now, by, well, enacting other laws that contain prohibitions. And you leave the liberal stance if you do that. Liberals do not believe in prohibiting things. Liberals believe in, well, people engaging in deliberation, in discussion, and in sorting out the common ground together. It's not about defending, prohibiting things. So how do we, how can liberals defend liberty against populists without themselves becoming authoritarian? That's basically the question. And that's what we were interested in this book, amongst other things. A little caveat, liberalism is a broad notion. We do not, when I say we, I'm talking about the people in the book. It's not something where we qualify each other as neoliberal or purely ordo-liberal or paleo-liberal or what have you. We considered it a vast paradigm, one that caters to certain areas of the left as it caters to the center. So it is not about a specific line. It's also a little bit like Chernus's approach that is more encompassing. My personal grievances with liberalism, I have made a list here that you can see is quite long. I'm not sure I have the time to really go into that, but I will just briefly leave it there and tell you that I think there are elements where classical liberals do need to put their house in order. One of the things is perhaps this extreme economic focus that was not a good idea, and especially the fact that liberals with this focus tended not to have an understanding of what is going on in societies. Psychological processes in societies are a reality, and that is something that economics-based liberals never had an understanding of, and that is something that needs to be corrected. I think you will find some of that in the book. The book has 4 parts. It's about, first of all, understanding what populism is, then how you deal with it in the political arena, then seeking these liberal responses that I already talked about, and finally, some people engaged with thinkers from the history of ideas, influential figures like Laclau, who was already mentioned here, but also Michael Sandel and other people. Just a list of a few essays. I already mentioned Maximilian Priebes' essay on representation and the yearning for sovereignty. I think a very good paper is also Aristotle's paper, who explains that populism is a threat to liberal democracy because it changes structures in the longer run, and it makes societies morph in the direction of clientelist regimes, and that is something that may be very hard to undo, and that's the basis of authoritarianism. Fabian then talks about how liberal parties can compromise and in what areas it would harm them and harm their agenda. We have a little bit of something about civic virtues, how that could be a liberal answer to populism, and also about more decentralized approaches to certain areas of politics, such as migration policies. All of this is meant as a springboard for discussion and and food for thought. As I said, you're free to come and have a look at the book. And Julian is one of my co-editors of the book, but also a co-author. He has something on the blockchain, but he will be talking about something else now.
Yeah.
On to you.
Well, I would just start to say a few words. So in the edited volume, my co-author and I, we discussed a specific answer to populism, which is called crypto democracy. We explain what crypto democracy is and then explain and then discuss whether it's a solution or not. And since this is not, a conference on AI and populism or something, I think I want to present something else, namely my own theory of populism that was published last year in epistemic. Yeah. So I will just give you like a brief rundown of the theory of populism. So first of all, the question that I think really need to ask ourselves is, what is populism, right? And perhaps the first thing we should really ask ourselves is, what is at stake? And I think that correctly identifying what populism is really matters. If we misunderstand the nature of populism, we will misunderstand its origin, its likely social effects, and of course, also its potential remedies, right? And there's a number of existing theories of populism that I think are all, for various reasons, wanting. And I will be very quick, since we talked about it last time. For instance, one of the main theories is the theory of populism of Ernesto Laclau, right? So what is populism according to Laclau? It's a strategy to gain power that it involves rhetorically constructing and pitting the people versus the elite and creating unity with empty signifiers such as America First. But this theory has a big problem, right? For Laclau, all politics is populist, yeah? But if all politics is populist, then we can no longer differentiate between, let's say, proper conservative politics and populist conservative politics, right? It all levels it, right? And I think it's really important that we can remain this distinction between what's conservative and what's populist. And I just give you a really quick example that really brought home this message for me. In the presidential race between McCain and Obama, it was a very nice, very interesting conversation between McCain and one of the voters. There was a discussion, and one of the voters was, but what do you think of Obama? He's not even an American, he's a Muslim, and so forth, right? Producing all this nonsense. And McCain was going to this voter and saying, my dear friend, yeah, Obama is a politician, yeah, he's a good person, and he and me, we just are distinguished in one thing. We have different ideas of where the nation should go, right? And politics needs to be about respect, right? Then 4 years later, Trump gets the same question. What does Trump says? That's correct, right? Obama should have never been voted in, and so forth, right? So if we don't have the correct understanding of populism, we cannot distinguish anymore a conservative like McCain and a populist like Trump. So it really matters that we get the theory of populism correct and that we get the definition of populism correct. I'm very sorry that it looks like this. I don't know how this computer works here. But now you know where I am. Same thing with Car's model theory of populism, right? He says populism is a thin-centered ideology. It involves the distinction between the pure people and the corrupt elite. And then there's something like a volonté générale, which basically just means that people have a unified moral outlook, yeah? Also a theory about the meaning of populism. But that theory also doesn't work. In the paper, you find an extended explanation. Here will be very brief. Why doesn't it work? Because his theory cannot explain why populist leaders and populist people are against institutions. Because even if we assume that people would have a shared moral outlook, right? They would still have instrumental disagreement, right? What is the best way to generate economic growth? What is the best way to make unemployment go away? What is the best way to defend our national interests against enemies, right? You can have, even though you share all moral values, you still can have instrumental disagreement. And if you have instrumental disagreement, you still need institutions, right? So this modus theory has all kinds of problems explaining basically real world phenomena that are associated with populism. I'm editing as I go. I still have 2 or 3 minutes.
If you have to.
If you have to. So what I do in this paper, I give a theory of populism that is based on 4 axioms. And these 4 axioms basically help us to explain a huge set of ways how populists typically think, how they typically speak, and how they typically behave, right? If you have these 4 axioms, then you can, in a deductive manner, explain all kinds of ways how populists usually, what their standard behavioral patterns are, what the standard belief patterns are, and so forth and so forth. And of course, I cannot go through all the deductions. I do this in the paper. What is the benefit of that theory? Well, it explains why populists reject compromise and pluralism. It explains why they distrust institutions and intellectual elites, and it explains why they embrace direct democracy and strong leaders. And it explains why conspiracies and fake news accusations are so common. I end on this note. Again, why does it matter? I think, and that's really the take-home message. Populism's epistemic commitment is incompatible with the core assumption of liberal democracy, I argue in the paper. Liberal democracy is built on the idea that human judgment is fallible, that truth is hard to come by, and that disagreement is the expected outcome of people deliberating sincerely about political problems. Populists, on the contrary, think that truth is self-evident and that the only thing that we need to do is to implement the truth, right? And so populist ideology builds on an epistemic premise that is incompatible with democracy, and that's why populism is dangerous. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being so precise. The floor is now open for questions and comments. Yes, please.
We still identifying ourselves. I'm Joanne Rudis, anyway. That's helpful. Thank you. So this is for Naomi. In general, this is background to what I want to say to Naomi, but as a historian sitting in this conference, I'm often find it a bit hard to get what people are saying into focus, because I'm not sure when we're talking about perennial problems of democracy and when we're talking about things that are specific to now, how those two things relate. And I wasn't sure in the case of Naomi's work whether you're interested. I mean, history came in through Hobbes, Rousseau, but it wasn't clear to me whether you were interested in the longer history of ideas about problems of listening. But I had a couple of things to say about a longer history. So one is about vocabulary. I mean, it seems to me that listening may be a key word now, but it may be expressing something which was expressed by other terms at other points, not necessarily meaning these terms convey exactly the same thing, but that they're at least analogous. So public opinion is an obvious concept to think about. Is it that public opinion has been devalued as a concept and listening does a kind of work that the concept of public opinion doesn't do? I think thinking, if listening has risen in importance as a word, thinking about what it conveys that other possibilities don't convey seemed to me of interest. In fact, quite a lot of talk around representation as a concept is sort of about listening issues, and concerns about how all this work go back a very long way. I think, for example, of Mark Knight's book, Representation and Misrepresentation, about the late 17th and early 18th century in England, which is about the problems of discerning what the people actually think. The second thing I started thinking about, in terms of there being both a long history and things that are specific to different periods, is the devices you use to listen. So fashionable modern devices, which I don't think you mentioned, will be things like focus groups or citizens' juries. But there have also been devices or notions in the past, like the coffee house is a place where you might hear opinion. The Ottomans used to send agents out to coffee houses to hear what people were saying and report back to the government, so they had information about that. A French historian, Pierre Carrillo-Cohen, has written a book called L'État des Esprits, which is about how the Restoration governments in France ask prefects to report back on what people are thinking. Those are both examples of regimes which don't have formal mechanisms and therefore attach all the more importance in what I think was the same sort of function that opinion polls sometimes served in communist East Europe. We're not sure we've got the political mechanism, so we need other kinds of devices so we know what people are thinking.
Vox populi.
Thank you ever so much. That's extraordinarily useful, in the sense that it's quite nice to hear someone else resonate things that I was thinking. So exactly, public opinion and representation are two of the kind of concepts or terms where I'm saying that I think listening is sort of there, implied with them. I'm not saying it coincides. You're absolutely right. It might add less, or it might take something away, or it might sort of retune them, if you like, in some way. To answer your question, I suppose, about what I'm trying to do, sorry, a lot in 20 minutes, but I suppose I don't think I'd say what I do is history of ideas. I probably would call it, I mean, I work in the continental tradition primarily, so I probably would think of this as a kind of genealogy of a concept that never quite reaches conceptual status, right? So the idea is that it's a strong reading that sort of finds a concept of listening in these other historical discourses. I think the idea of thinking about devices and like historical practices is something on my mind. I don't think it will fit within the one book project for now. I can think of lots of different methodological ways to get at the question that I have. A philosophical genealogy is not the only one. I'm not even sure it's the best one, but it might be the one I'm best equipped to try and do. But I'm quite sensitive to that idea. I mean, certainly in the framing, I think about contemporary devices and how they intersect with that sort of sketch I gave of the three sort of potential accounts. So the one that says that focus groups are the kind of answer to some of this problem, the Deborah Mattinson version of how to run the Labour Party, for example, is sort of fits into these accounts. It self-constructs a concept of listening. So in that sense, I just want to say thank you so much, because you're helping me here achieve what I want to do. Obviously, I try to read the philosophers I'm reading not in a transhistorical way. There must be some material context. You know, it's such a sketch today, but we cannot talk about Hobbes without understanding that he takes a particular position on authorization because he's responding to certain threats that are kind of going on. Likewise, when Plato intervenes and starts thinking about, we've got Plutarch talking about on listening in lectures, and this is a concern at the time among lots of ancient Greek thinkers that people are going to be seduced and they're not going to listen carefully enough. And I think about my students in lectures all the time. But when Plato is so suspicious of certain things, and then he even connects democracy to kind of out of tuneness and this sort of thing, this is because he's responding to these anxieties about rhetoric that happen over a very long period. So I'm quite interested, the first section of the book looks at how that changes from like Plutarch to kind of Machiavelli. And I try and give it a thin historical context within what is a philosophical project. But I'm mindful. I mean, I suppose what I'd really like is it not just to be me trying to do this, but a community of people to think, including historians who would be better placed. So thank you, really. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to.
Yes, you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. All of you, this was really insightful. My question is actually for Naomi, and it's more like I think a clarification question a bit. I was not sure whether I completely got, I think when you talk about listening, there could be like one way in politics, which is more about like the metaphor, no?
Mhm.
And I think in political theory, I think of I don't know, the work of Dobson, Listening Out for Democracy, or other works on this topic. I think they really have this idea, okay, it's about the metaphor. No, listening to the people seems to be like a repetition of the idea of recognition or something like this, no? And then, I mean, in other fields like the sound studies or something like this, it's really about the ear, like the materiality of it, like the sensory of it and so on. And I think either way, it makes a difference how you think about this. No, I mean, when it's about the materiality, the concrete vibrancy of like listening and how it's functioning and so on, and how it's opposing the other senses like the eye and like the visual or speech and so on. I think this is different from thinking about this in terms of it's a concept to understand how representation is functioning, how recognition is functioning, and so on. And so therefore, I was not sure in what sense you, or like, I think I couldn't completely understand in what sense you're actually talking about listening, like in, yeah. Maybe so
I
much.
suppose, thank you so much for that. That's also helpful to be able to address that point. I suppose I would push back about what you're saying about these are different, or the sort of, oh, there's a metaphorical use and then there's a more theoretical use. I think I'm interested in metaphors are really interesting that we even use them. And I don't think it's possible to put the use of these words into a certain categorical box and say, I think there's a reason that listening kind of cuts across some of these dimensions. It might be a cognate for recognition in certain situations, but it might be for many other different types. Like not all people who talk about listening, whether as scholars or political activists or just people on the doorstep, mean recognition. It's quite clear from the context that they mean something else. Listening also might not mean the relationship between, say, government or politicians and the people. I focused on that today because the topic for the conference, but like in the Machiavelli example, that's about advisors to government, like above all else. And I suppose I think the fact that it's so polysemous and can cut across, that it wants to bring in the import of these different things, that people actually, when they are moaning, say, that politicians are not listening, that actually perhaps they do want some of the more affective dimensions. If I talk to local politicians and they ask about the project because they're nice enough to, they immediately go to their affective relationships with their constituents. And if I asked local councillors what they thought listening was, they would say it was about care and understanding and empathy. But if I asked the civil service, they think it's about the mechanics of government or something like that. So even apart from philosophers, but I think it's really useful we use the same word and have done for a period, even if it has been growing. There was like a big uptick in the use of this word, as Joanna was kind of hinting at, this possibility. So I suppose for me, I think that's the movement of metaphor is precisely what makes this interesting. But I also think this movement happens within many other concepts. I don't think listening is unique. And my approach to other concepts would also want to try and take into account rather than putting them in separate fields. So yeah, I quite deliberately, someone said to me with the grant app, you've got to define your term. Tell us exactly what listening was. And I was like, that's the point of the project, is to kind of explore that it isn't pinned down. And I kind of think its political force comes partly from that. I agree it's difficult to deal with it, and especially annoying probably for people in brief presentations. Thanks.
Maybe I'll jump into this debate a little bit, because I'm asking myself, if we don't define what listening means, we can try and define what it is not. So obviously it's the opposite of being deaf, not listening at all. But then there's also tone deaf, which means somebody can hear it, but doesn't really make sense. And then the most interesting contrast is actually with understanding. Because Charles de Gaulle famously, when people were protesting, he would stop the discussion at a certain point and says, je vous ai compris. I understood you. That's it. There's nothing more to talk. And the understanding is sometimes means I understand you better than you understand yourself. I know what you really want. I know where you're coming from. I know that when you want to stop immigration, you're just projecting your fears on some external, you're scapegoating somebody. I don't need to pay attention to that. What I will pay attention is to the reasons why you are unhappy. And then if I'm Joe Biden, I'm going to use 1970s style central planning, industrial policies. I'll create some kind of prosperity. Who cares about inflation? And then everybody will be happy. And then they will stop talking about xenophobia because I understand you better than you understand yourself. Or maybe I don't. So that's where I see the contrast. Let me just throw some question in the other direction. Godefroy, it seems like what you have is more a populist criticism of conservatism. That is Orban et al. These are the people who change the constitution every 5 years to make sure they're going to win the next elections. They are totally presentist. It's the conservatives who say constitutions should be very difficult to change. They should last for a long time. They should be short, to the point, able to be interpreted and reinterpreted. That's the American concept of constitution. In Latin America, they change the constitution all the time. It gets to be very long, not very workable. So are you really criticizing populism, or are you criticizing conservatism?
Okay, sure. Okay. That's a very good question, of course. Well, I have actually problems with the concept of populism itself. I mean, in the way that we would, because I mean, very often when people talk about populism, they say that populism argues in terms of us versus them. But when we talk about populism, we actually use a very similar strategy by saying that populism is everything that liberalism is not. But I mean, when you have a look at like constitutional thought, what I've presented, there are always like what you would call populist elements in liberal constitutionalism. So it's not like you can have a clear-cut distinction between populism and the rest. So the idea is not to have a populist, I mean, in this sense, I don't know what it would mean, populist criticism of conservatism, but it's certainly a criticism of conservatism, but not from a populist point of view, understood as everything that liberalism is not, of course, but by using certain elements which are already there in the, I mean, I think in the liberal tradition of constitutionalism.
All right. We still have more than 5 minutes.
I can ask a question if you want, actually. So
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there was a question basically on this use of populism for my co-panelists. Because when we talk about populism, so we talk always about different things, actually. So there is populism as a political theory, Laclau, Mouffe, etc. So explicitly populist, I mean, which says that they are populists. They are what we call populist movements, which are not always related to populism as a political theory. I mean, sometimes, yes, Podemos is an example, but as I said yesterday, some other political movements do not agree with this kind of political theory, but they are still called sometimes populist. People also use populism to talk about like the People's Party in the US in 19th century. So, and we also use populism to define certain ideas. So just as you said, maybe my position might be called populist from a certain point of view. So it's not like there is a something that can be called populism, seems to me. But it's always like different aspects, which are very often actually related to the liberal tradition. It's like, you know, very hard to, I think, to have a clear-cut distinction between both. Or, I mean, we from a kind of strategic point of view, we might want to have this distinction, but I'm not sure it works.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Julian will immediately agree with you, and so
yeah,
I will try just and say one thing about that. And yes, the definition is difficult, and that's also why we have a whole chapter on
Yeah.
it, trying to get a hold on it. What I think is probably, well, the working definition that most of us have been using is the one you just quoted. It's the us versus them thing, the definition of the people and those who are not part of the people. That is a strategy that we see with parties, mostly xenophobic parties, and the AfD in Germany is just one example of them. And I think the difference is that, yes, liberals will tend to say that people who advocate excluding certain groups are populist, but liberals do extend their view to everybody. So that's the difference. The liberals don't liberals exclude populists from the idea of being liberals, but they don't exclude them from a notion of the people or the people living in a certain country. It in that sense, and I know that that's another contested word. In that sense, liberalism stays universal. Or universalist. Liberals think about rules for everyone, and exclusion is not an option. Exclusion is an option in political denominators, but not in political strategies. That remains countrywide and inhabitants-wide. May I also have a question? But you,
I would also like to answer, yeah, if that's fine. I mean, the problem with populism is really that I mean, there's so many dimensions. The first dimension is that probably every object that has ever been called populist is only tied together by family resemblance, right? So there's no one property that all things that have ever been called populist share, right? It's a weasel world. But then we can nevertheless ask, is there among our contemporaries, right? Is there a specific political ideology that is different from conservatism, that is different from liberalism, that is different from anarchism, that is different from feminism? Like a distinct political philosophy that is distinct, right? And then we can try to see whether such an object exists and what are the guiding principles of that very distinct political view. And that political view, right, might be very specific and might have nothing to do with 1890s peasant political philosophy, basically, right? And so what I tried to do in the paper is, first of all, to make clear, and of course I couldn't talk about it today, like what are the actual rules that apply when we argue about what is the correct definition of populism? Yeah? What are the rules that apply when we discuss what is the best definition of populism? What kind of game are we playing, right? And then I defend this notion of populism that I develop on various theoretical margins, such as explanatory power. But I agree with you that if we look at all the objects that have ever been called populism, they share no property, right? Except being called populism.
Yes, I have a question about this listening thing. You triggered me. I was thinking about what it could mean and what economists usually do when they try to get a hold on a subject is that they try to make a model. And I made a model in my mind. And the first thing I needed to do was to understand how communication works in the political process. Because if there's someone who's supposed to listen, there must be somebody who speaks, not just votes, but speaks. And then the question is, how does this happen, at which stages, through which channels, etc. So I need a whole map of that. And that's, I think, what would help me understand that a little bit better. And then also listening, to me, sounds like, yes, somebody is speaking or expressing him or herself. And I listen to that. But that's a very static view of things. If then afterwards the question is, did a politician listen enough? And as you said, did he implement what I told him? Did he listen in the sense of, did he carry out what I asked him to do? It's static. And my understanding of politics as a marketplace, as an economist would say, would be a more dynamic one, where it's an ongoing conversation, where people express preferences, and then these preferences change, and they change not only due to things that go on among the populists, but also through the views that politicians feed into society by whatever they express. So politicians are not just those who carry out the political desires of the electorate, but they also create political ideas, they spread them, they transform them. It's a dynamic process. And the word listen to me, well, either you see it at a micro level, and that seems feasible to me, but at the macro level, it would seem too static.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd really have to say, I don't think it's static at all. And I think it absorbs all of the things that both of you have very rightly pointed out. So I begin at one point by trying to, like in a more schematic way, ask, what does it mean to be listened to? Or what would it mean? I try and use this phrase because I think it works in English. What does it mean to be heard out? So not just a minimal threshold of being heard, which might just be in the moment, but you know, to deliver, to feel understood, perhaps, because I think there is that dimension, and it might, in fact, exceed what one's own understanding. You know, looking through Austin's work on uptake and speech act theory, we definitely take that into account. But also, yeah, I don't think it is limited to a one moment event, I suppose. Now, it might be that some people mean that when they say that. There are some people who say they're not listening, and what they mean is, I gave an order, I voted for Brexit, get it done. But I'm not sure it only means that. I think it might mean, yeah, it could be this more open conversational process being heard out. I think that's why I use this phrase, it's convenient in English, that it could be more procedural. I suppose I don't think it is reducible to political communication or expression, but mainly because I think of the way in which it is used. So most of the literature, the little that there is, that talks about political listening, thinks of it as communication. But I think people are trying to get at something that might be closer to what today people talk about as vibes, right? Sometimes what they really mean is resonance, right? They don't really mean the more conventional, traditional sense of political communication. So I'm trying to include communication, but also potentially think beyond what that conventionally means. If a speaker says this, a listener hears this and goes back and forth, but it might mean something that is closer to Stimmung, or this connection between Stimme and Stimmung, for example, that this is revived in the contemporary context. I mean, no doubt all of the responses tell me one thing I guess I already knew already, that it is a risky, difficult project. It might be too much of a wager, but there's a bit of me that thinks there's something stubborn about this idea, but it needs very, very careful parsing. But I don't think it can mean one simple thing.
Okay. Right,
I'm gonna take it as a.
we have two more voices, so let's just take them together and wrap this up. So first Lila, and then you.
Basically said what I wanted to comment or ask. Okay. Thank you. It's because there were three views on what is it. The populism is strategy, it actually is a tactic, and it might be an ideology. From my point of view, what you were speaking about, it's about leadership. Listening is about leadership. It can be populist, but it can be transformative. And transformative not from the point of view that you impose or you try to change the attitude. It's about changing the perspective. For instance, when the EO constituency approach with the problems with migrant, you show that there is direct connection between the decision of the local politicians or national politicians on sending troops into the country and bringing this and the flow of these migrants. You change the perspective instead of, you know, what populists would do, just aggravate the logic. of leading or appeal to basic instincts. Yes, confrontational logic, blaming the other. So this changing the perspective is a very important part of the transformative leadership, unlike the populist leadership. And that's what I would stress.
Thank you.
Joanne, can you take, okay, just the microphone, so. Could pass the microphone back there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, Naomi, you partially answered my question. From the start, I was thinking that, what about vice versa? How do the people listen to politicians? It's, I know this is maybe in broader sense, it's a question of communication, but also we can think about the voters being uninterested in politics, so they do not listen at all, or they are really biased in politics, and how they really understand if they agree with the politicians. So I don't know if your research covers this part, but it's, yeah, because Karen, she mentioned about the static way of listening. So how do you cover it in your research?
Yes, this dimension, it's not simply, it was simply because this was about the people. So I only focused on that dimension, but absolutely. There's also a really interesting shift in all of the newspaper kind of cuttings and headlines that I've kept, that in Britain, people were talking for a long time in the run up to Brexit and afterwards of listening to the people, of politicians needing to listen. And then suddenly at some point when things were going quite wrong for the Conservative Party in the last term, the paper started announcing they are not listening to the government. And then the question was, it looks like, are they listening to Labour or not? So it turned around with like politicians being heard again. And I think it's quite interesting about which way round seems to be more salient in the public discourse. But yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with everything that Aurelian said on yesterday, that, it's certainly not a static or rigid kind of dynamic, because politicians shape public opinion, if such a thing exists, and the extent to which they are heard by the public is also important, and also the listening that the public or the people are capable of, or what they even think listening is also shaped by that interaction and dynamic. So it's absolutely, so thank you so much. I know we need to finish.
Any closing statements on this? Right, so I believe Bertolt Brecht said once, first comes the fresh and then comes the morality. We put Bertolt Brecht on his head. First we had the morality, and now it's the time for the fressen. So, guten Appetit.
Yeah.